Okay, good afternoon, and thank you everyone for attending today's panel discussion on the state of mental health in teen and young adults post-pandemic. I would like to first start off with some introductions. I am Roxanne Cox, a public health professional and board member for the Afrolatino Project and Festival of New York City, and I'll also be your moderator for today's discussion. Assisting me today is Alexa Cox. She's currently a student at Virginia Commonwealth University, studying psychology with a passion for advocacy and mental health and well-being of teenagers and young adults. A part of the panel today is Dr. Angel Jones, an educator, activist, and critical race scholar who is currently a visiting assistant professor at Southern Illinois University. Her research explores the impact of racism on the mental health of Black students with a focus on racial microaggression, racial battle fatigue, and gendered racism. Thank you, Dr. Jones. And then we also have here Tristan Fields, a clinical mental health counselor residing in Auburn, Alabama. She earns a Bachelor's of Science in Psychology with a minor in English from Tuskegee University and a Master of Education in Clinical Mental Health Counseling from Auburn University. Tristan is also an ordained elder in the non-denominational church and enjoys pursuing her God-given purpose through the avenue of counseling. We do have two more panelists that I hope will join us shortly, but we are going to go ahead and get started. I first want to talk about what brought us for this discussion. A little bit of data from my part from the CDC. This past March, they started to highlight, or they published a report highlighting the mental health issues of high school students in the United States during the COVID pandemic. According to the data, a third of high school students reported experiencing poor mental health during the COVID pandemic, and 44% reported persistent feeling of sadness, hopelessness over the past year. Similarly, per an article in from the Mayo Clinic, 44% of college students reported symptoms of depression and anxiety. In addition to that, 36% of students reported experiencing some racism, with the highest levels being reported among minorities, especially Black students, which, as we know, can be linked to poor mental health. So we are now here kind of talking about the mental health issues as it results of, it can result from the unique identities, such as for our particular community, the Black and Latino community, ranging from cultural or language barriers, socioeconomic status, immigration, cognitive or physical ability. With that said, today's discussion is to focus on the mental health issues affecting the youth within our community, and I brought together the professionals to kind of get their unique perspectives on this crisis and address the needs and how they're actually addressing the needs within the Black and Latino community. So at this time, I'd like to just give each panelist a minute to kind of share their work in the community and give us a summary of that. We can start off with Dr. Jones, if you'd like to start off first.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I am Angel Jones. My pronouns are she, her, and Aya. I am a researcher and an activist, and my work looks specifically at how racism impacts students of color, more specifically Black students and Afro-Latinx students. I really look at, especially when you think about this past 2 years in terms of the pandemic. Yes, we had COVID, but my work more so looks at the impact that the racial pandemic had on students. And I think I love the stats that you read, Roxanne, but I think a lot of them don't really think about the racial pandemic and the specific impact that it has had on our students. So a lot of the workshops and the discussions I've been having have been with Black students specifically talking about how they're coping with that, talking about how they're dealing with racism and racial microaggressions and how it's impacting their mental health. Because a lot of Black students don't even know that it's racism specifically that is causing them to struggle because folks aren't helping them with that. But once they're able to name what's happening to them, there's this sense of relief and empowerment that they feel once they realize that they're not the only ones struggling with it. So I've been really intentional about creating spaces for students to have those conversations.
Okay. Very nice. Very nice. Thank you. Tristan?
Hi, everyone. I'm Tristan. I currently work with adults and families, some adolescents, as a substance abuse therapist. Previously, I have worked with adolescents at the kind of college age, working with first generation college attendees, hopefully soon to be graduates, that are starting to realize that race does have a part to play in their graduating rates, in their grades, and in them progressing into the professional field. So that's been really awesome. I'm really excited that we're having this conversation.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so as starting with the pandemic, and students had to kind of adjust to completely going from a remote learning environment and then transitioning back to an in-person setting with some restrictions. My question, first off, is how, in your experiences, has this transition affected the students? And it can be positive and negative, and how they're kind of dealing with their workload or just dealing with the day-to-day life as they're attending schools. So I will pose this to both.
I just want to clarify, are you talking about when they had to go virtual or now that they've gone from virtual back to in-person?
Going from virtual back to in-person. So the whole transition, I think it kind of affects them in both levels. Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So I think, and there was a recent article that talked about it, is that when students of color and employees of color, specifically Black folks, were coming back into the spaces, there was this fear of having to deal with microaggressions again. So when they were for virtual, although there were a lot of negatives that they experienced, a lot of folks reported at least not having to deal with the racial tension within their workplace or having to deal with microaggressions or macroaggressions. So there was this added anxiety on top of the health concerns of having to go back into those spaces, into classrooms with students that didn't understand what they were going through, or teachers or admins and the things like that, and weren't really acknowledging the fact that they just lived through a racial pandemic, and that was really negatively impacting their mental health.
Mm-hmm.
What I've said that I've seen so far, the positive side is that students of color have been able to get back in the classroom and get help from their classmates, where some, in lower SCS communities, sometimes Wi-Fi wasn't that great, so they were missing some classes and weren't able to get all the educational engagement that they needed. So a positive is that they're getting back in the classroom around their peers, face-to-face communication with their teachers. A negative that I have found is that there are many students that their teachers cannot relate to, like Dr. Jones said, the racial pandemic that has been going on. So they're catering to coping skills for, being able to wear a mask, going outside to take their mask off for a little while, but haven't been really honing in on the emotional implications of the pandemic on minorities. So that's one of the things that's kind of not been that great.
Mm-hmm. And kind of elaborating on that more, Tristan, how have you seen specifically in the minority communities, Black and Latino communities, anything differently that in terms of trends that you're seeing within that community that may differ from other communities that are just maybe specific to the Black and Latino community?
Specific to us, what I've seen is that parents, we come from a very family-oriented culture. So parents have been, pushing, if you're not getting it from the classroom, we're going to rally behind you to, help you through it at home. Unfortunately, Common Core has changed the way that children learn, changed the way that teachers teach. So it's been kind of difficult for the families to support our minority children through the learning process. And then adding on, like I said, the emotional piece, we don't always have the language to understand emotionally where children and young adults are. And so we do the best that we can to kind of help them through, but sometimes we just don't have the language.
Yeah, that's true. And how do you think outside of the family, outside of the home, how are these issues being addressed, and are they being addressed?
On the surface, they're being addressed. A lot of schools, always say to the children, well, you can always go talk to the school counselor. You can always talk to the psychiatrist. You can make those appointments, but then that's taking away time from the educational day, taking away instructional time, and kind of, then that turns, what I've seen in my line of work is kind of DHR gets involved and all kind of stuff when the child is just simply asking for some help with maybe some coping skills, some stress reduction. But if we don't have, minorities in those positions that understand or that can relate, it kind of doesn't get addressed sometimes.
Yeah. Representation definitely matters in that aspect.
Definitely.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the next question?
Yeah. So our next question. So for many students that graduated between 2020 and 2022, so most of the students who either had like a full year online and they graduated and went to college, or they had a partial year, or for me, I graduated in 2021, so half of my year was online and the other half was like optional to go in person. So how is that the transition from high school to college? The transition from high school to college has become less clear for those specific graduating classes. So what do you guys think has been the most difficult for these graduating classes into their freshman year of college? And then what is the transition support that those graduating classes need?
I can start, Tristan. Is that okay?
Mm-hmm.
I would say, so the transition, especially for students of color from high school to college, is already one that is really hard for them. And research shows that it has either a positive or a negative impact on how they do in terms of their first year academically, so socially, emotionally. So that's just under normal circumstances, right? So if you add on top of it our health pandemic, our racial pandemic, our babies have really been struggling with that. And I think just finding a sense of belonging for them has been even harder, especially if they're transitioning into a predominantly white institution. So they already felt like they didn't belong. So that, coupled with the mental health struggles they're having because of the racism that they're experiencing or seeing on TV and the racial pandemic, that has been really challenging for them. And I think kind of what you were talking about earlier in terms of within the home and outside of the home, because there is this negative stigma within our community specifically about getting mental health support, our families aren't getting it. And then even those supports that are outside of the home, they're giving them to students, but not acknowledging the impact that racism is having. Right. So if you are supporting a student's mental health, but not acknowledging what's actually negatively impacting their mental health, which is racism and the racial pandemic, the students aren't getting the support that they need. So even at the collegiate level, even though they're giving students supports, they're not the appropriate supports based on what our students are actually struggling with.
Yeah, and I think that just to bounce off of that, it's the social aspect, because we know when we're dealing with mental health, we got to take into account the social connections and interactions. College is where you branch off from your family and you go and you create your own social circle while you're pursuing your academics. And with kind of being virtual, and that line from virtual to in-person kind of being unclear for high school graduates, it kind of leaves them, or what I've seen through my clients, kind of left us at a little bit of a social disparity. Like everything is texting and everything is, I'm going to shoot you an email, where, traditionally college has been, I'm going to go to my friend's dorm and we can have these conversations about mental health when maybe the professor doesn't get it or the college counselor doesn't get it. You can have those social interactions with friends. The streamline from virtual to in-person or partially in-person, hybrid or whatever, kind of dismisses that social factor.
Yeah.
Yeah, I 100% agree, and I was going to piggyback off of the both of you since I did graduate last year, so I kind of fit into that group range. But I definitely think like the most difficult thing, like going into freshman year, was like how to pick up the pieces of what was lost in a way. Like my first half of the year, so up until winter break, was online, and then we had the option to go back. And I remember me and almost the entire senior class was like, no, like we all just didn't go back because we had gotten so used to the remote learning. So we were like, we didn't know how to pick up those pieces and go back to school. And also because maybe we were seniors, it was just kind of like, all right, like we're done, like we'll just make it to the finish line in a way. But I do remember very vivid details of senior and even junior year, because half of my junior year was online too, was those are the most important years for like application season, like recommendations, jobs. I had a job, like, and I remember that like trying to develop like that in-person motivation, like to hustle, like to get working, to make sure everything was submitted on time. Like that motivation lacked so much because we were so used to just like waking up and sitting in our pajamas and turning on our computer and just sitting there and doing our homework. So I definitely think on the aspect of like academics and work, that was a difficult point. And then like Tristan said, the social aspects too, like a lot of my friends like me, and even I know like some of my cousins, my family members, like our social motivation lacks too. Like we were less likely to want to be around people because we were so used to being inside. Like when we first had to go home, we were like upset. We were like, no, I have to go outside. I have to walk around. And then we were like, no, this isn't so bad. And then we were like, no, I don't want to go hang out with anyone. And then I realized when I started college in the fall, it was like a whiplash because there was so many people around me all the time. I didn't know like what to do. So it was a really interesting transition, and I think it's very like fluid and different with every person because our personalities are different. Like a very extroverted like teenager might be like, oh, this is great, and then someone who's very like to themselves and doesn't mind being by themselves may be like shy away from that. So it's a very interesting process, I think.
I just want to take a moment now to introduce Patricia Telford. She's just joined us. She's a social worker that works in the New York City, Long Island area. She also has a organization that she founded called the Peer Action Towards Empowering Self Incorporated that helps navigate higher education and the world of work with while focusing on their wellness. And this focuses on youth, families, and the communities. So welcome, Patricia.
Thank you so much, Roxanne. And thank you so much to the organizers of the festival for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about youth and mental health, especially in our community where there's so much more of an impact. And because of what was recently mentioned, the stigma of not really wanting to address mental health often, it's really important that we have this conversation. So I'm really excited to be here.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to piggyback off of the next question to another. And we're going to start with Tristan because I know you specialize in first generation American students. So this question is more in that realm, and the rest of you guys can piggyback off of that as well. So the question is, as a community of immigrants or first generation American college students, there are many psychological and social challenges that these students face, resulting in 1 in 3 students leaving college within the first 3 years. So can you each speak to your personal experiences and how you've navigated these challenges?
Okay, I'll try to make this one quick. Being being deciding to go so far from home from school was a culture shock. So I was accustomed to being around people that shared the same culture as me. Coming all the way to Alabama to go to Tuskegee University was a huge culture shock. So being the first in my family to complete college in one sitting, meaning in my 4 years, then going so far away from home. Academics were, difficult at another level. It wasn't just high school work, it was college work. Wanting to leave was often thought about. And how I kind of worked through that was just reminding myself that the purpose of me going to school was bigger than just me being able to get a job, was bigger than me being able to get a degree. It was literally like we're progressing not just minorities, that maybe didn't have the opportunity, but it was kind of for my family. So just constantly having that motivation to keep going, don't stop, ask for help when I needed help. That was a big lesson that I learned in college, not just educational help or academic help. When I needed to go talk to the school therapist, I did, made my appointment, and I went. Self-care, all of that good stuff, it really made a difference in staying in school and being able to maintain going to an HBCU. This is a shameless plug, but going to an HBCU definitely helped. It put me around people who came from similar backgrounds and who were of like mind. So that was a huge help. Finding that social connectivity in college helped me to stay.
Okay. Next.
I would definitely agree with that. I'm also a first generation college student, and a lot of the students that I work with are. And I think two of the things I see between both my experience and theirs is one, when you are first gen, it's kind of there's so much you don't know that you don't even know you don't know it. Right. So I think once I got to school, and I love my mom, that's what I call her. Like, I love her and she wants to do everything and help me. But there were so many things that she just couldn't help me with. Right. And there were questions that I should have been asking that I didn't know I should have been asking. Right. So I felt very lost, but there's this pressure because you are the first in your family to really make your family proud. So I'm just like, I don't want to mess up this opportunity. I really want to make them proud, but I don't know what the heck I'm doing, right? So I think what Kristen said in terms of finding community was really important for me. So I found our multicultural office, and I lived there basically for my 4 years. So that was really important to me. Then I also think just being from a Latino family, like, we're together every single weekend. It's like every weekend is a family reunion, and not being able to be there for those events because I was away at college, like, there's this guilt that a lot of us feel because we're not able to be with our families all the time. And I feel like they understand it, but like it still hurts them and still hurts me. So like really having to feel that tug, like, I'm here for y'all, right? So I think for me that was a struggle, and that's definitely a struggle a lot of my first gen Latino students have, especially those that were working in high school to help support their families, and then now that income is no longer there, there's an added guilt for them. So those are typically two things that I see with first generation Latino students specifically.
Mm-hmm. That is definitely true.
Absolutely. I totally agree with everything that was said. For me personally, I feel that groups in colleges and universities make a world of difference. Personally, in my freshman year of college, there was a group for the students of color on campus called the Academic Achievement Program. And it's where a lot of the different cultures were celebrated. And, we really focused on the differences that we experience being at a predominantly white institution and, having to work twice as hard. And so definitely finding the groups that can provide you the support to really help you push through those times when you feel overwhelmed, when, you may be that only person of color in the classroom is really significant. In terms of the youth that I've worked with, I have seen a lot that will leave after the first semester or first year because it does get overwhelming, especially with the money aspect and needing that extra income for the family. So I've partnered with a lot of community organizations that do have sort of paid internships that help people while they're in school to try and earn some money to help out, and also again, kind of introducing them to programs that can help them with the extra support so that they can, if they want to, stay in college and continue to, get to the next phase and then eventually dive into a career path that will get them more earnings and help them, to achieve those goals of being able to support the family and themselves. But it is also not always for everyone. So there are also programs that through the internships they're able to start working right away, and that helps them in terms of being able to address some of the needs that are at the forefront with trying to get food and other needs that are really really important at the time, and then maybe later on getting back into school. So it all depends on what's going on with a person at the time. So I really like to get an understanding of, what's really the concern for the youth and address it, how it presents. And sometimes it is really like maybe you might have to take a step away from school for a moment, focus on getting the economic status together, and then going back to focusing on the school goals and achieving that way.
Very interesting. So like you guys had said, Latinos are very family oriented. So how has parental morals, such as, how they view how they would view success for their child, like in a career stance, financially, their religious beliefs. So how have those examples played a role in the mental health decisions for their teenagers, their children, and young adults?
I can start us off. I would say religion plays a huge role in the Latinx and in the Black community, just because there's this idea that, oh, well, just pray about it. Or, God will take it away. And all of that I wholeheartedly believe. However, I think when it comes to mental health, folks don't really acknowledge the health part of the mental health. So I've done plenty of talks about religion and mental health. So if you had cancer, yes, you would pray about it, but you're also going to go to an oncologist, right? Like you're also going to get treatment and do those things as well. So it's possible to pray about the struggles you're having with your mental health, as well as go and see a therapist. I believe that God put those things for us, right? So that we can take care of it. But I think until we see mental health as an actual health concern, folks aren't going to address it the same way we do physical health concerns and things of that nature.
Absolutely. Yes. Mm-hmm.
I agree.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that's absolutely true. And sometimes there are other focuses too that families may put on to the youth and kind of pressure them. I don't see it as much now, but when I started the work trying to force folks into like relationships and marriage and starting a family right away was kind of a big thing. And people feeling the pressure of like, oh my God, I need to have my career together, but I need to get married like next week and find, my mate and then have a kid right away before I'm considered too old to do so. Because, having the family continue is really important in the community. So nowadays there's more of a focus on the career and education, but the relationship aspects and the religion in that sense is also a big theme, and it's very prevalent for a lot of the youth and how they make their decisions for sure.
I agree with everything that's been said. It's amazing that going away, you kind of start to create your own beliefs and your own thoughts. So it's a good thing to kind of go to school, have that transition so that you can start to cultivate your own mental health routines and have your own mental health kind of hygiene routines, what I like to call it. And just like Dr. Jones said, of course, pray about it. That's fantastic. But if we kind of just only pray and don't go and check in just like we do with any of our other health concerns, our mental health will go lacking. We'll have a great prayer life, but our mental health concerns will go lacking. And our parents teach us the foundation. Sometimes we find out that the foundation's a little faulty. We have to learn to disconnect from that foundation and build a foundation that works for us, not discredit it or dishonor it, but just build a foundation that works for us, because what worked when they were coming from, Panama in 1940 and 50 doesn't really work in 2022 when we're, doing some things differently. So we got to build our own foundation.
Absolutely. Yes. And kind of question for you, Tristan, seeing that you're on both sides of that coin, how do you kind of, in your ministry, do you bridge the gap between the mental health and what you're preaching, with your constituents there? How do you kind of have an even playing field with that?
It's a little difficult, especially being in the South. It's a little more difficult than it would be if I was in New York. But what we do is once a month, we just have an open, honest mental health talk. I've done some research, and we've kind of been pulling from different people in the Bible that kind of have some mental health concerns that we see through scripture. And some people think that that's a stretch to kind of connect, but I've found it super helpful to show, like, well, let's read this, and then let's read the definition of this, and kind of, connect it together. What I call it right now is Christ in the couch. That's the project that we're working on. We can pull it in. We need the therapist. Like, I have a T-shirt that says, I love Jesus and I have a therapist. Like, they go together. They just have to go together.
Yeah. Yeah.
I kind of want to comment on the question I asked, but about like the parental morals that, play a part in, their children's, any of their decisions really, but specifically their mental health decisions. I think that where I find some people around my age are having like the problem, I would say, or the difficulty in that is that a lot of us, I think, as you guys said, they come with the foundation that their parents had set, or their guardians. Those are the people who, created their life and also built the basic, necessities and stuff that they're always going to keep. And I think some of our problem is trust, but trusting ourselves to know what we need and what we want to go after, because it's very easy for us, to be like, turn around, I'm going to go call mom or figure it out. And while that's good, but sometimes, it gets to a certain point where it's like, where do you, like, you have all these goals and all these things that you want to get to. So where do you, find that line to be like, everything they're saying makes sense, but the path I'm choosing may be a little bit different than what they had in store for me. How do I trust myself enough to get myself down that path? And I think I've seen it become very different for a lot of people my age, a lot of people around me. I think we're all on a different path. And that's what everyone, said to me when I went to school, that this is the time to, you find yourself, you figure out what you want to do. But literally everybody is on this large spectrum of in a different place. So it's me, I'm somewhere, different than maybe some of my peers in the way that we're going about our goals, or how we, use what we were taught at home to help us. So I guess my commentary is kind of just I feel like it's such a broad spectrum. How do we learn to just trust ourselves and just be okay, I'm gonna do this, I'm gonna figure it out, I'm gonna learn, I'm gonna take the extra resources and trust myself, and I'm gonna still use my home resources for help if I need it, but it's about me now, if that makes sense. So it's interesting.
Definitely.
Yeah, as your mom, I'll say
Yeah.
Okay. So I kind of want to take a step back on something that was previously discussed or stated earlier. So what was also in the CDC report was an increase in, I guess, racial acts that are occurring in schools. I mean, racism in the Black and Latino community is very common, but over the last 2 years, racism has definitely increased. And so I'm kind of posing out here, how has this differed since the pandemic, and how is it affecting the students' mental health? And I know, Dr. Jones, this is something that you focus on a lot, so I'll start with you.
Absolutely. I feel like I don't think that racist ideologies have changed. I think folks are just bolder about their racism, and I attribute that to 45. I can't say his name because I am not a fan, and we will not empower him. But I think a lot of it has to do that, right? I feel like he emboldened racists in a way that we haven't experienced since a long time ago. And I think especially because this is the Afro-Latino Festival, I want to focus on those students specifically and what the racism they're experiencing. So my work is currently looking at how it's impacting our identity development. So the racism and the anti-Blackness they're experiencing within their own homes or within our own culture, because anti-Blackness in our community is a really, really bad thing. So I think especially with the racial awakening of 2020 and George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement, a lot of my Afro-Latino students are talking about coming into their Blackness and being more proud and thinking about that. But then the members of their family that either aren't Black or don't identify as Black, which is a whole nother session that needs to happen, right? Just kind of what those conversations have been like and what that tension is like, right? So not only are they dealing with the anti-Blackness outside of their home, instead of being able to come home to peace and safety and security, they're also dealing with it within their own community. So I think that's very unique to the Afro-Latino students that I am dealing with right now, just the racism both in and out of their homes.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, that is definitely a conversation all in itself, because there is definitely that struggle. It's an internal struggle of, especially within the teenagers and young adults who are trying to find themselves to begin with. Now they're struggling to find their identity culturally, then socially. So it's a lot. And I think between both of that, that can only impact your mental health tremendously. And now you're at the age where you now have to make these adult decisions, but you have all these struggles. So I can definitely identify with that. Yeah. Patricia?
Yes, I totally agree. And I would say that there's also a level of frustration because sometimes the services aren't there, or if they are, they aren't culturally competent, right? So when students and youth are mentioning these kind of frustrations that they have with finding their identity and just functioning with all the different tasks that they have to do, going to school or having access to proper health care and proper resources, devices, so that they can get online schooling or make it to school in person, depending on where they're coming from. It adds pressure in a way, and it adds more frustration, and oftentimes will end up presenting as depression and anxiety with a lot of students, because when they do reach out to teachers or school staff, a lot of them don't understand, because they don't have that level of cultural competence to understand the struggle of the differences with race and ethnicity, and how colorism can play a part as well. And so it can be extremely frustrating for them. So I've definitely noticed a lot of students mention that until they feel very comfortable with someone that really understands all of the aspects of what it means to be someone in this community, they won't even discuss how they're really feeling. They won't even say that, I've really been feeling sad about this situation for X amount of days, or that, they've had trouble completing certain tasks or feel like super anxious in certain situations, because they really need to have somebody or a group or an institution that understands the level of support that they need in this community and as students of color and people of color.
Mhm.
Tristan, you have anything? Oh, okay. Jennifer Paulino is about to join as well. Hi, Jennifer. Welcome.
Everyone, how are you all?
We're good. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. I know that Dr. Jones is about to leave, but so I just want to get one final comment from her before she leaves. In terms of your research on the racism in schools and the resources on the university level, what do you see as the gap, and how can we kind of help to bridge that gap as a community as well?
I would definitely say that the gap is culturally competent counselors that really understand the impact that racism is happening. So like I said, I look at microaggressions, and one type of microaggression is a micro invalidation, which is when a student of color is coming to them talking about a racist act that they experienced, and the counselor responds with, well, how do you know that that was really racist? Or maybe you're just being too sensitive, right? So we need counselors that aren't going to add insult to the injury they've already been experiencing. And representation also matters. So research shows that students are less likely to seek help from a white counselor because of those micro invalidations, right? So we need culturally competent counselors and more counselors of color.
Thank you.
Well, thanks for having me. I have to go teach my class. I really appreciate y'all.
No, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Take care.
Okay, and just quickly, so Jennifer, thank you so much for participating in today's discussion. I know you're a health and wellness professional, and you work with Patty. And I understand that you have also been working in the public health, the New York City public school system as well. So you also bring that perspective. We've been kind of now talking about the racism on racism in the schools and how that affects the mental health. And we're going to now kind of pivot to and add to that, now considering all the recent mass shootings that are going on, especially in the schools. And so my question with that is now to everyone, how is that affecting the students, and how are they coping? So whoever wants to chime in and join, take.
Well, I can say that from what I've noticed, besides the mass shootings that have unfortunately taken place recently, students in the New York City area and Long Island area have dealt with school violence in different ways for many years. And so they, in some ways, have become kind of numb to violence, especially depending on the area that they may be in. But in other ways, they're really wanting to have support. And again, it goes back to like the culturally competent support, because a lot of times there aren't folks that understand that the social determinants of health, what access they have from when they're born and then going through elementary school, middle school, and high school really impacts how they react to certain situations, right? So if they've been surrounded by violence from the time they were very young, oftentimes when they see it, they're not that phased. And that can be concerning as a clinician, from the get-go, when you encounter a young person who's just very jaded and kind of like, it is what it is, and again, that can be part of their mental health presentation, and that they might have some level of depression or anxiety going on, right? And so in working with counselors who understand and who get it, they can really process that and get to a point where they realize that this is not normal. You know, they should not be so exposed to violence and feel like it's okay, right? And so I think that now with the mass shootings, unfortunately, and it being in the news, for the last few weeks every day, it's kind of woken up some of the older adults and older people, and certainly politicians who really have the ability to sort of help the situation, realize that, you know, young people are crying out for help and that they should not be ignored. And so, you know, from what I've seen, the youth are coping, but they have just become so desensitized that there needs to be another approach, and not just kind of um, you know, having this constantly be on the news and then, you know, in a month or so going back to what everything was before, but really trying to implement positive programming that's going to help them, and with culturally competent staff and counselors that can really help them out.
Okay.
And I would jump in that from a parent's perspective too, and speaking to other parents and kind of school community members that they're seeing much more anxiety in their children. That it's I mean, even the heightened level of the school drills, I mean, even for my son who's only 7, having to be exposed constantly to this, you know, uh, being on guard, and even the process of the drill itself, where they have to kind of shut the doors and they have to hide, and that process in and of itself can be pretty traumatic for kids, and you know, they're having these drills on a much more regular basis than I think they had to have in the past, and they're having to have these conversations in schools much more than they've had to, specifically around these shootings. So as a parent, I see it in speaking with other parents and other school community members and educators. I've also heard a lot about just the heightened level of stress and anxiety and nervousness and anxiousness that they're experiencing on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, I actually wanted to pick up on what you said as a most recent high school graduate and now in college. I think that, like what Patricia said, it's like it's a normal, like it's like our coping mechanism is that it is what it is, to say, like, we're, you know, we look, and I think what also plays into the part is the social media aspect. Like, it's almost everywhere. I mean, literally the other day my friend had sent me something like, oh my gosh, did you see this? And, you know, I'm reading it and I'm just like counting, like, in my head how many other ones like there was. Like, I even remember in high school, like, because I know, like, the first major mass shooting happened, you know, years ago. So, and I remember there was a trend when I was in middle and high school of them happening so consistently. So I even remember in high school, like, it was like like our hyper awareness, our anxiety was like on 100. Like, I remember I would walk in the hallway and, like, because hoods were not allowed to be worn at all, somebody who was wearing a hood, like, me and my friends would literally be like, you know, that's a little suspicious. Like, we, like, you know, it's time to go. Especially if we were like the only people in the hallway. Like, we were just so, like, alert and aware, and especially the social media, like, information is spreads like wildfire between teenagers in a school. So one wrong message from someone feeling, you know, a little bit worried could have the whole school running out during lunchtime. Like, so I think, like, that anxiety, that hyper awareness has become what shouldn't be coping, but has become our coping. It just has become like, it's so normal. It's there. Like, we go into school, like, you know, this is a possibility. Like we're doing more and more drills. We have more and more rules. I know a lot of schools, they have to wear like clear backpacks now because they have to see what's inside, the backpack to make sure you're not coming inside with any harmful weapons. So yeah, definitely think the coping is just to just tolerate it, which is, unacceptable for us. But yeah.
And to kind of just jump in real quick, what I've been finding is super important is cultural competency on another level, like adding so much more empathy than we have in times past as clinicians, because I didn't grow up in, we had fire drills, and that was the extent of what we knew, stop, drop, roll. If somebody came into the school, we had to follow the directions of the teachers. Cultural competency for me with some of my younger clients has been, well, how does this make you feel? And that's such a broad question, but you can pull so much from there. And then having culturally competent clinicians in schools, because anxiety shows up for Black and brown children differently than it does for non-minorities. So knowing that, okay, they're not just being bad in the classroom, that's anxious energy, and they don't know what to do with that. Or why are they withdrawn, sitting in the back of the classroom? They're not being defiant. It's because they're nervous that something might happen. So being able to identify the reason for those behaviors and then addressing them with empathy. Empathy just says, let me get on your level. I might not have experienced that, but let me get to a place where I can understand. We kind of confuse sympathy and empathy. I don't want to be sympathetic. I want to be empathetic to our children's experiences so that I can help if I can't do anything else but listen, because I haven't had that experience. I can try to understand, to try to make some different coping mechanisms available to them.
That's great. Absolutely. Okay. As we're winding down to our last couple of minutes, I want to pose a question to each of you, kind of summarizing everything that we've discussed today, but wanting to leave here with what's next. What can we do next, especially for our community? Mental health, as we know, within our community has always been some sort of a taboo. We don't talk about it. And if we do, it's a hush hush. It's not outside of the home. But every day we're seeing different examples of how it's manifesting in some form. So we can say, yes, the teenagers or the young adults are coping, but are they coping in a positive way or a negative way? How are they utilizing this to grow and kind of move forward? So I posed the question of, what do we do next? How can we kind of bridge the gap at home as well as in our different professional fields? And what are the charges that we do for the people who actually have the power, like our politicians and all the other people who can make certain decisions? So that's just, I think I probably put a couple of questions out there, but just generally, if everyone can kind of put their take on what they envision. I'll start to, my top is Jennifer, so.
Sure, thank you. So I'll come at it from the education standpoint because that's the lens that I have. And when I was part of the Office of School Wellness Programs, we gave a lot of resources to schools in terms of creating conditions where students can thrive physically, mentally, emotionally, socially. One of the things that we always pushed a school to have is a school wellness council. And so a school wellness council means that you're going to have members from across the entire school and the school community, part of a committee that's going to be consistently invested in creating the structures, the systems, the processes within the school building so that the wellness, the well-being of children is part of their culture and it's part of what they do and it's part of how the school is run and it's prioritized from the top down and all across. So that's one of the things that within a school setting, as adults, as parents, as mental health professionals, to ensure that families are informed that these councils can and should exist within their schools. They might already exist in their schools, that they can be involved, that students can and should be involved. Um, and also, I think it's so important for schools to communicate with families and for families to communicate with schools about what's going on at home and at school. What are we doing at school to address the mental health needs of our students? Okay, we're running these groups, we're running restorative circles in the classroom. All of that is well and good, but families need to be informed about that. This needs to extend beyond the classroom, beyond the school building. It needs to go home. Parents need to be able to know and have the resources to reinforce whatever it is that they're doing in the school. And if there's anything that's happening at home and families need help, they should be able to count on the school community to support them, because schools are where children are spending the majority of their day, the majority of their time. And so I think schools have a responsibility to create that environment where students can access mental health resources, where educators have the tools to provide culturally competent health education to their students, which is required. And that these school wellness councils can be a source of real support for the students, for the educators, for the administrators, and for the families. So I would take that kind of holistic approach to ensuring that kids have what they need to feel good at school and at home.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Tristan?
I agree with what Jennifer said. I think that in addition to making sure that those resources are available at the schools, I think that making it available to families, not only by saying, hey, this is a list of resources, having some community engagement, some sort of initiative program, and Roxanne, like you said, getting our politicians involved, getting our local officials involved in making sure that there is a component of mental health. Because if not, what I've learned in the school system is that school counselors are quick to make a report, are quick to, send a caseworker out to a home before doing some type of preventative action, making phone calls to, parents before we take that big step. So if we kind of do the work to make sure that mental health resources are available and that people are actually utilizing those resources before we have to, get to those larger measures. So I would just say making sure that we take a hold to those resources and kind of make it mandatory.
Yeah. Thank you. Patricia?
Definitely, I agree with all of that. And education is hugely important to me as well. And I believe in New York State, they are actually implementing, a mental health curriculum. And so I think that COVID has kind of thrown so many things off track. But I believe that it's super important to kind of get back to that and implement mental health curriculum and different focuses on how to cope with different situations that pop out throughout your life into the classroom and into lesson plans, because a lot of students go through so much more than what they're being taught in the classroom, and they never figure out to cope with that until it maybe gets to the point of being out of control in a way. And then people are kind of frantic and searching for different types of resources. So I think if we start in the classroom and, like Jennifer and Tristan said, involve the community, involve parents, then we can really start to see a lot of positive change and impact the youth in a really powerful way. So that way they feel empowered and knowing how to react to certain situations, and knowing that as they grow up, there's going to be a lot required of them in terms of their emotional intelligence. And so if they start to learn about that from when they're very young, I think they'll feel more empowered to cope better and function better in society as they become adults.
Great. Thank you. Well, I'd like to thank everyone for participating in today's discussion. It was a great discussion, and I thought, a conversation that was definitely necessary. And it will continue because, we have to continue having these conversations so that we can help not only ourselves, but the next generation, and to get them to a place where everything, we're on an up and up, and not just kind of staying stagnant, and addressing the mental health issues as they are, and not thinking of them as something foreign, but addressing them just like how we address any other health issues, physical. So I think we continue these conversations, and I appreciate everybody.
So thank you very much for
participation, and have a wonderful evening, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.
So thank you very much for this warm welcome. I'm really excited to be here. My only regret is that I'm not there in person. Este maldito COVID. But in any case, one day I will be there again. I do want to just say one advisory note. I'm going to be showing you a preview of the cover of the book, but I'm not allowed to post it, to show it. So anyway, it's just between us. So don't screenshot it, don't share it with anybody. But in any case, so let me jump right into it. So first, a little bit of background so you can put into where I'm coming at with regards to the book. An important challenge for racial justice that we face in our society today that frequently gets overlooked is the anti-Black bias that exists in communities themselves considered ethnic and racial minorities. Indeed, the conundrum of how anti-Black violence can still be so pervasive decades after the achievements of the civil rights movement can't be readily understood nor addressed with the traditional sole focus on white Anglo individuals. In the language of the US Census Bureau, non-Hispanic whites are presently about 57.8% of the population and declining in numbers. This means that the ongoing upkeep and silent acceptance of anti-Blackness implicates many other racial and ethnic groups. Exploring Latino complicity and anti-Blackness is particularly helpful. So let me now share my screen so that you don't have to just be looking at my face the entire time. It would be quite boring. Okay, as a multi-hued ethnic group, hence my, oops, not just yet, wait. I don't want to get to that when you said I was trying to use my fancy laser pointer. Here we go. As a multi-hued ethnic group, Latinos are often viewed as free of racism, or at the very least, free of its most exclusionary forms. Examining how anti-Blackness still does manage to manifest itself amongst the racially mixed rainbow of Latinos is a powerful illustration of how people of color themselves can fortify racism. So, the January 6th terrorist attack on the US Capitol included several Latino members of the US supremacist group Proud Boys and their chairman, Cuban-American Enrique Tarrio. Just as the white supremacist violence in Charlottesville, Virginia back in 2017 also included Latino attackers. The Southern Poverty Law Center has noticed that there is an increasing trend of more Latinos joining white supremacist hate groups. The racial violence is also evident amongst white Latino law enforcement members. And Latino opponents of Black Lives Matter protests. And yet, Latino white supremacists are not the only problem. Anti-Blackness is also manifested in Latino communities against Afro-Latinos, African Americans, and other people of African descent in a myriad of contexts, such as the workplace, the rental and purchase of homes, educational settings, public spaces of leisure, and the criminal justice system. Examining Latino agency and anti-Blackness helps us better understand the complexities of racism and what is needed to be more effective in an increasingly racially diverse world. Now, but before I discuss how Latino anti-Black bias surfaces in anti-discrimination law cases in the United States, it'll be helpful if I first explain the origins of Latino anti-Black bias for people in the room who may not be as familiar with our histories. Over 65% of the approximately 10.7 million enslaved Africans forcibly brought to the Americas were taken to Latin America and the Caribbean, whereas only about 3.2 to 6% were brought to what is now the United States. Today, there are approximately over 150 million of people of African descent in Latin America, representing about 1/3 of the total population. However, these are considered conservative demographic figures, given the histories of undercounting the number of persons of African descent on Latin American national censuses, and often the complete omission of a racial or ethnic origin census question. At the same time, people of African descent make up more than 40% of the poor in Latin America and have been consistently marginalized and denigrated as undesirable elements of the society since the abolition of slavery across the Americas. Yet the view that racism does not exist is pervasive in Latin America, despite the advent of social justice movements and social science researchers demonstrating the contrary. When the BBC surveyed Latin Americans regarding the existence of racism, a significant number emphatically denied the existence, and many made statements such as Latin Americans are not racist, it's not a racist region, for the simple fact that the majority of the population is mixed. Thus, the denial of racism is rooted in what many scholars have critiqued as the myth of racial democracy. That is, the notion that the racial mixture, or the mestizaje, in a population is emblematic of racial harmony and insulated from racial discord and inequality. Academic scholarship in the last 20 years has critiqued these Latin American mestizaje theories of racial mixture as emblematic of racial harmony. Yet Latin Americans themselves still very much adhere to the notion that racial mixture and the absence of Jim Crow racial segregation are such a marked contrast to the US racial history that the region itself views itself as what I term racially innocent. In part, the absence of a legal critique of the Latin American comparisons to the Jim Crow US has enabled the Latin American racial innocence stance to remain. So in an earlier book, Racial Subordination in Latin America, I provide that legal critique. That earlier book is about the ways in which the Latin American denial of racism operating in conjunction with the notion that true racism can only be found in the racial segregation of the US veils the actual manifestations of racism in Latin America. The book argues an examination of the role of the state after the abolition of slavery in regulating race through immigration law and customary law disrupts the picture of Latin America as racially innocent. It assesses the way in which the contemporary Latin American anti-discrimination law system seeks to eradicate the legacy of racial inequality wrought by the historic racism of the state. All of which is to say that the legacy of slavery is just as relevant to the Latin American context as it is to the US context. So when people from Latin America and the Caribbean migrate to the US, they bring along their racialized baggage with them and transmit it across generations into US Latino culture. This is what my forthcoming book, Racial Innocence, Unmasking Latino Anti-Black Bias and the Struggle for Equality delves into. Remember, you're seeing the cover, but you're not seeing the cover. Don't tell my publisher. I'm not supposed to tell anybody. They want to unveil it later in the month. Okay. Anti-Black racism that arises outside of the unfortunately familiar US frame of Anglo-white versus Black bias can be mystifying for many people. This is in part because US Blackness is primarily conceived of as embodied by English-speaking African Americans. In turn, anti-Blackness is popularly understood as a uniquely US phenomena affecting those English-speaking African Americans with an occasional recognition of the racialized struggles of Africans and others in the African diaspora. Civil rights leaders are also seemingly reticent to air the dirty laundry of the bias that exists within communities of color, lest it distract from the real racism of white supremacy. However, all the while, Afro-Latinos and African Americans suffer from acts of discrimination at the hands of Latinos who claim that their racially mixed cultures immunize them from being racist. This is what I term Latino racial innocence, the cloak that veils Latino complicity in US racism. In turn, the public ignorance about Latino anti-Blackness undermines the ability to fully address the interwoven complexities of US racism in developing public policies and enforcing anti-discrimination law. My message is that judges and the rest of society need to learn that Latinos can be racist too. My research objective is to aid those who care about the pursuit of racial equality by providing a more expansive view of the greater swath of the population that is harmed by anti-Black bias and how. I focus on how anti-Blackness is manifested in Latino communities against Afro-Latinos, African Americans, and other people of African descent in a host of contexts, such as the workplace, the rental and purchase of homes, educational settings, public spaces of leisure, and the criminal justice system. By contributing the missing piece of Latino agency to an understanding of the complexities of racism, social justice actors will be better positioned to be more effective in an increasingly racially diverse world. So in the book, I excavate the otherwise silenced voices of Afro-Latino and African-American victims of Latino anti-Blackness from the case files of discrimination cases. In examining how discrimination claims of Latino anti-Blackness arise, two central patterns become evident. First, Latino anti-Blackness is more prevalent and serious in its consequences than many commentators in politics and the media care to admit. Second, the ability to identify and address Latino anti-Blackness is hampered by the notion that Latinos cannot be prejudiced or racist simply because they are Latino. It is for this reason that the tales, the narratives of Latino anti-Black discrimination recounted in court cases are so important, inasmuch as they help to disrupt the Latino myth of racial innocence and clarify Latino agency in racism. The interrogation of this Latinos can't be prejudiced, so-called defense to racism, is especially illuminating for the legal enforcement of anti-discrimination laws. For instance, when Eddie Frazier, an African-American man, wanted to rent an apartment in the suburban Long Island community of Smithtown, New York, it was a Latino homeowner who refused to consider his application. The Latino landlord instead chose to wait 3 more months, losing out on rental income, for a non-Black applicant to surface. Yet a jury was persuaded that no racial discrimination could possibly have occurred due to the fact that the owner was a Brazilian who denied harboring racial bias. She testified that she had mixed race heritage and numerous of her Brazilian relatives had Black and Indian ancestry. Juries, though, are not alone in being misled about Latino agency and racism. The case of Maxine Sprott is illustrative. Maxine, an African-American woman who worked as a deputy director of what in New York we call NYCHA, that is the New York City Housing Authority, in its Office of Equal Opportunity. They regulate the PJs, the projects, just to put it into context. Maxine alleged that in this workplace, her Latina supervisor, Office Director Rosalind Reyes, harassed her with derogatory comments about her work performance, even though Maxine repeatedly received positive performance evaluation ratings, like very good and good. Each positive performance evaluation that she received was then followed with commentary by Reyes about Maxine's lack of leadership skills in her role as deputy director. She also harassed Maxine about timesheets and excluded her from various office functions and meetings. When Maxine could no longer withstand the onslaught of derogatory commentary about her competence, she filed a claim of discrimination with the general manager of NYCHA. Exactly 3 days after she submits the claim, Director Reyes submits a performance evaluation that for the very first time rated Maxine as marginal. And as a result, she was denied a managerial merit salary increase. Then another Latino NYCHA official, Chairman Elaine Franco, informed her that she was being transferred to another office where her material responsibilities were diminished and she was moved from a well-furnished private office into a cubicle. Hence my little diagram here. Only when Maxine was, when she filed her claim in court, was she able to reach a settlement agreement with NYCHA and receive financial compensation. And you'd be wondering, well, why am I bringing up this case? While any number of reasons may have influenced Maxine and her attorney to settle the case rather than move forward with a jury trial, one contributing factor could very well have been the great significance the judge placed upon office racial diversity as mitigating claims of discrimination, Latino diversity in particular. For the judge, it was immaterial that when Chairman Franco transferred Maxine to an effectively lesser position in a cubicle at the same time as he dismissed 2 other African-American female employees as part of his ostensible reorganization plan, that this was not a pattern the judge refused to admit. Instead, the judge inferred that these facts failed to raise an inference of discrimination because, and these are the words of the judge, the new director is a Hispanic woman. The remaining staff is comprised of 24 Hispanics, 23 African Americans, and 1 person categorized as other. So here the judge accords a Latino dominant workplace and the supervisor's Latina status great power to circumvent racism. Here and there is the judicial presumption that Latino co-workers cannot be bearers of racism. A corollary of the judicial presumption that Latino co-workers cannot be bearers of racism is a judicial notion that all Latino places of origin are racial equivalents. The case of Arrocha versus CUNY provides a useful example here. Jose Arrocha, a self-identified Afro-Panamanian tutor of Spanish, sued his university employer for failure to renew his appointment as an adjunct instructor. Jose alleged that the Latinos who directed the department where he worked discriminated against what he called Black Hispanics, and that there was a disturbing culture of favoritism that favored the appointments of white Cubans, Spaniards, and white Hispanics from South America. Yet the court dismissed his claims, in my view, because there was not an understanding of the ways in which a color hierarchy informs the ways in which Latinos experience racism and national origin bias from other Latinos, who are not a harmonious, homogeneous, pan-ethnic grouping. The dismissal of the case was justified by the judge based on the fact that 5 of the 8 adjunct instructors that were reappointed instead of Jose were natives of other South or Central American countries, such as Argentina, Peru, Mexico, and the Dominican Republic. The judge explicitly stated that diversity in an employer's staff undercuts an inference of discriminatory intent, which is not the actual law, by the way. Instead, the judge inferred non-discrimination from the presumption that Latino ethnic subgroups are all interchangeable and homogeneous. So the advancement of other Latinos in the workplace meant that there couldn't possibly have been a intent of discrimination against Jose Arrocha, the Black Latino in the workplace. This perspective fails to appreciate the ways in which internal Latino national origin bias is rooted in a racialized hierarchy of Latin American countries. We may not talk about it, but we all know it, right? Where countries perceived or touted as European are viewed as more advanced than those more significantly populated with people of indigenous descent and African descent. So to return to that list of countries that the judge found is all equivalent, indicating the absence of bias, Latin American racial constructs would rank Argentina as number 1 as a highly valued white country, followed by Peru and Mexico with its most indigenous population, and most derided would be the Dominican Republic and the claimants on country of origin, Panama, because of their dominance by African descended peoples. For Latinos influenced by Latin American racial paradigms, where each country has a racial identification, a diverse workforce of Latinos is not the immediate equivalent of a bias-free context, nor is a color preference divorced from a racialized ideology within the Latino context. However, Latino anti-Black bias shows up not only as an expression of individual Latino racial attitudes, but also in systemic structures of intentional exclusion. For instance, in the case of Hunt versus Personnel Staffing Group, Latino employees of a Chicago-based nationwide job placement agency described how their Latino supervisors trained them to exclude African-American applicants from job placements in favor of Latino applicants. They were instructed to immediately reject African-Americans based on the stereotype that they would not be capable of working as hard as Latinos. The lawsuit details how dispatchers who dissented and nevertheless sent African-American job seekers to a company would later be reprimanded by their Latino bosses for doing so and disciplined and threatened with being fired. The placement agency would start the day by separating out Latino job applicants from African Americans. They would enter the Latino applicants' contact information into a database so they could be easily reached when jobs opened up. African American applicants rarely received the same treatment. Instead, Black applicants were usually instructed to go to an office at dawn to wait for assignments that rarely ever came. One agency dispatcher testified if it was 10 Mexicans that would come at 1:30 p.m. and 25 African Americans that were there since 4:30 in the morning and were waiting to be sent to work, they would send the Mexicans first. This Latino-run employment agency effectively ensured a secondary racial caste system of Latinos over Blacks in the already segregated Chicago area labor market that privileges Anglo-whiteness. To wrap up, I'd like to address a concern I often hear that people of color cannot be racist because they do not have power. When Latinos and other people of color for that matter are active participants in the denial of access to an important life opportunity, a home, a job, an unimpeded education, fairness in the criminal justice system, and entrance into public spaces, all based on race, they are no longer just passive holders of an anti-Black cultural prejudice. They are part of the problem of racism. Certainly, none of the victims of anti-Black bias in the narrative of discrimination I examined in my research would be placated with the disclaimer, your experience is not an example of racism because Latinos don't have the systemic power to be racist in white Anglo-created structures. One can immediately envision such a victim replying, oh yeah, that so-called non-racist Latino is the one who oppressed me for being Black. A Latino claim of racial innocence in the racist world white Anglos created in the US is a thin reed of moral superiority when the Latino hand is the one forcefully slamming the door to Black inclusion. So my book project is more than just a call for recognizing that Latinos can be prejudiced too. Rather, it's an entreaty for all interventions into matters of racism to critically engage how Latinos and many others collaborate and sustain structures of racism. By recognizing that they are part of the problem, interventions can address them as part of the solution. Judges and juries can be taught to desist from being distracted by the I can't be racist, I'm Latino pseudo defense to accusations of discrimination. In short, dismantling racism in the US requires that every component of its structures be taken apart, even the ones articulated en español, in Spanish. We do this by becoming racially literate about Latino anti-Blackness and engaging in meaningful coalition work, such as some of the examples I have up there for you on the screen. We're going to turn now to conversation, and then with questions and answers. But if all those questions don't get to be answered, I encourage you to follow me on Twitter at Professor TKH, and stay looking out for the new book. Pre-orders available online later in the month. Let me close out my screen here. Try to find out. Oh, wait a minute. Where I can do this. Oh, here. Okay, stop share. All righty.
Great, thank you so much, Tanya. That was really wonderful.
La toma tiene ese nombre porque Lo que nos han dicho nuestros mayores es que ahí era donde tomaban el agua para hacer las minas. Nuestros mayores que fueron traídos como esclavos a este continente, que era el sitio donde hacían como las pilas para recoger el agua lluvia y luego por los zanjones poder hacer la minería cuando eran esclavos. Que una vez se abolió la esclavitud, ellos siguieron haciendo esa actividad. Ellos los liberaron y los soltaron como a un niño cuando nace, sin oportunidades y sin nada. Y les tocó que utilizar como esas mismas formas que venían desarrollando para poder sacar las familias adelante. Por eso este es uno de los primeros palenques libertarios del norte del Cauca.
Este trabajo es antiguo, este trabajero es antiguo de la gente de antes. Ya ellos faltaron y quedaron los otros y ya quedamos nosotros también en este trabajadero. Yo me gusta mi trabajo, porque hay que trabajar, porque si uno no trabaja, ¿y a dónde va a comer? ¿No? Peor es uno ir a coger lo ajeno. Ahí sí es berraco, ¿verdad? Ahí sí es berraco. Y sabiendo que uno trabajó, come del sudor de su frente.
O sea, aquí hay dos cosas que van cogidas de la mano, lo que es el río y la minería, porque el río para nosotros es madre y padre.
Esta es una forma de pesca. Esa nosotros le llamamos barbacoa, esa ha sido transmitida milenariamente por generación. O sea, mi papá me enseñó, yo le enseñé a mi hijo, ya mi hijo la hace. Uno en una noche allí fue pescado para toda la comunidad.
Uno con 2,5.
¿Y ella cómo?
44.
¿Por qué tan poquito y por qué tan barato?
El mejor precio que hay en este oro.
Pero en cuanto a 45 de eso.
Da 55. Gracias.
O sea, lo que piensa la multinacional es coger este cerro, devorar este cerro, todo este cerro, y voltearlo a la parte de la Toma, donde estuvimos el pasado viernes. O sea, lo bajan y hacen aquí un gran cráter. si ese cerro se llegue a quitar de allí o llegue a ser intervenido por una multinacional, la cultura de nuestro pueblo, la gente de la Toma, toda esta gente no se sabría para dónde coger. Entonces, quitar este cerro es un futuro incierto.
Porque es muy duro. En este país la gente que es desplazada la tratan como basura. Y la gente que solo sabe hacer minería acá, irse a una ciudad, a las calles a pasar trabajo, entonces no. Bueno, buenas tardes a todos y a todas las que están aquí. Desafortunadamente estamos ubicados en un territorio que es rico, que es de mucho interés económico y que el gobierno ha contribuido para que la comunidad sea desalojada de aquí, en tanto que ha venido entregando las tierras. Tenemos claro que estamos enfrentando a unos monstruos como son las empresas transnacionales. Tenemos claro que estamos enfrentando al poder como es el Estado y que no es fácil.
De todas maneras, para sacarnos de aquí, tienen que saber cómo nos van a sacarnos muertos, porque caigamos en cuenta de que, por ejemplo, nosotros sacamos la conferencia de los niños que van levantando ahora, o para dónde los van a echar. Así por así no van a venir de a sacarnos de aquí.
No, y nosotros dormimos en montañas, porque ¿qué les quiero decir con eso? Porque a pesar de que nosotros de esta mina vive, el de la tienda, vive, el del cargo, o sea, esto es la fuente de la vida, ¿me entiendes? Nosotros no podemos permitir.
Ojalá
eso.
que Dios nos permita que eso no se haga.
La primera amenaza llegó vía fax. Nos hicieron efectiva otra amenaza vía mensajes de texto. Cabe decir de que ya esto era sistemático, porque ya nos habían matado un gobernador indígena. Es una cosa de que si usted a mí me dicen pruébelo, no lo podría probar, pero para nosotros es la lógica. Las multinacionales están acompañadas o los paramilitares han hecho su trabajo de limpiar el área. Y hoy por hoy, nuestros líderes somos llamados objetivo militar de los grupos paramilitares, Águilas Negras. Que es un grupo del Estado que dice combatir a la guerrilla, pero es un grupo armado del Estado.
Pero también me da miedo que con todas las amenazas que han habido, alguien muera en mi comunidad. No sabría qué hacer. Ejemplo, que le pasara algo a Lisifrey, que no sé, eso sería como muy duro y eso le tengo miedo. Prefiero que un día, que si alguien va a morir, que sea yo, pero que otro, no.
Estamos durmiendo cuando llegó un muchacho aquí y tocó la puerta. Y llegó y tocó y estoy preguntando por Francia como a las 2 de la mañana. Yo le dije, no, que Francia estaba en Cali. Ella estaba aquí. Pero yo le dije que ella estaba en Cali, ella había ido para allá, para donde ella. Yo le dije que Francia había ido para Cali. Y yo le dije, ¿para qué la necesita? Yo no, que para un trabajo, le dije, trabajo a esta hora, a las 2:30 de la mañana. Eso me parece muy raro que a las 2:30 de la mañana. Le dije, ¿usted con quién anda? Entonces me dijo, yo ando con unos muchachos. Y ese día para mí fue muy duro porque le digo que ese día de ahí para allá, que de pronto la cojan y la matan.
Ah, listo.
Suéltame, ya.
De todas maneras hay que dar la juega porque vos sabés, humanos, cómo amarran la información, ¿oí? Para coger la comunidad dormida. No, déjame que ahorita, o sea, hay que alertar la cosa. Que el jurídico notificó a Aníbal que van a hacer el desalojo el viernes.
En este momento nos están perturbando nuestras vidas. No podemos tener tranquilidad porque estamos con el temor de que a cualquier momento van a llegar, de pronto van a matar a alguien o no sé, algo por el estilo. Entonces eso es algo que a mí al menos me da miedo. Me da temor eso. Entonces yo no quisiera que eso pasara. Entonces, porque ¿qué va a hacer de pronto de mis sobrinos, de mis hijos? ¿A dónde van a ir a parar? Yo estuve en la ciudad y volví porque a mí me gusta esta tierra. A mí la ciudad no me interesa. O sea, eso es algo que para mí es fuera de lo común. Yo quiero vivir en mi campo, seguir respirando un aire puro, seguir viviendo con esta gente tranquila.
Bueno, pues ahorita voy hacia la cabecera del corregimiento, porque lo que estaba planeado para hoy, para mañana, se ha comenzado a desarrollar de hoy, que ha llegado la fuerza pública, y ojalá mi Dios pueda iluminar al gobierno, a la gente que tome la decisión, para que no se vaya a hacer ese desalojo. Porque en el momento en el que se llegue a realizar ese desalojo, corre sangre.
Lo que queremos que ustedes también entiendan que nosotros no estamos viniendo a atropellarnos, una cuestión, porque han venido algunos que han venido como en esta embriaguez a decir cosas como que si nosotros somos culpables de esta situación, no somos culpables, así como ustedes han venido trabajando todos los años que nos comentan nosotros.
No, es que el choque lo da el mismo gobierno cuando en tales dicen no, que deben de salirse, pues que es inconcebible, o sea, que eso no le cabe en la cabeza, solamente le cabe en la cabeza al juez.
Lo que hay que tener claro es aquí que nosotros somos, o sea, cada quien tiene un papel diferente.
Sí, sí, sí.
Nosotros no tenemos ningún interés personal en desalojarlos. Lo que cada quien está haciendo aquí es su trabajo.
La gente no van a salir de sus minas, o sea, que las minas no es negocio, ¿entiendes? Es como su vida.
Si nosotros vamos a entrar a debatir ese asunto, aquí no va a salir la solución.
Por eso.
Porque estos no son los actores de ese escenario. Es allá.
Harto por eso. Me digo, hermano, ustedes son colombianos. Nosotros también somos colombianos, entonces entre colombianos, ¿por qué tenemos que tirarnos, hermano? No nos tires.
Bueno, pues en la reunión se trató acerca del desalojo que va a haber mañana y la verdad la conclusión que quedó es que mañana nos reunamos todos aquí en la plaza de mercado para hacer una gran asamblea para tener a todo el personal enterado paso a paso de lo que está sucediendo.
Yo no sé, aquí la gente tiene que prepararse porque lo que esperábamos era que esto se notificara y una vez ellos notificaran a la alcaldía para que la alcaldía no lo ordene, pero una vez si no le llega nada, ellos lo van a hacer. Entonces mañana lo que toca es que decirle a la gente que se vaya preparando de una vez para defender la comunidad, porque en cualquier momento esto lo van a hacer. No importa cuánto hay que acabar, pero con fin de obtener esa riqueza, y desafortunadamente a nosotros nos tocó quedar ubicados en el medio de esa riqueza.
Hoy es un día, diría yo, histórico para nuestra comunidad, ya que se estaba gestando una orden de desalojo y que por la gestión de algunas personalidades del municipio o algunas personalidades del orden departamental se ha logrado suspender un poco esta orden.
No aceptaremos bajo ninguna condición que entren foráneos, que entren multinacionales a explotar nuestra riqueza.
Y yo creo que esto es puro paños de agua tibia lo que se nos están dando aquí. Aquí nosotros necesitamos que nos digan la verdad, que sea real, porque aquí esto es puro paños de agua tibia. No nos vamos a meter cabeza aquí. Aquí hoy han parado el desalojo, pero no se le haga extraño que de aquí al jueves, otra semana viene otra orden de desalojo del señor Tanya. Lo que necesitamos es que nos hablen claro de una vez.
A que se venga lo que se venga. Pero de aquí no nos saca nadie.
Ayer diríamos que al gobierno no le ganamos, pero le empatamos. Y los empates siempre hemos dicho que nosotros los celebramos como victoria. De la minería lo depende todo. El comercio, la educación, la cultura, todo es todo. Nosotros no damos una lucha por perdida y creo de que esto hasta el último suspiro de existencia que tengamos como cultura, lo iríamos a luchar.
Donde la abuela trabaja y el nieto sale a pescar, viene un águila y ultraja, queriendo desalojar al árbol de sus raíces, al río de su tradición, ignorando los matices que componen nuestra canción. Se quieren tomar la toma, nadie se la va a tomar. Se quieren tomar la toma, nadie se la va a tomar. Se quieren tomar la toma, nadie se la va a tomar. Se quieren tomar la toma, nadie se la va a tomar. Donde una mujer descalza y de la montaña el vientre viven en sagrada alianza que defienden hasta la muerte. Que no venga la codicia con máscara de progreso a bailar con la injusticia sobre lo que será mi hueso. Se quieren tomar la toma, nadie se la va a tomar. Se quieren tomar la toma, nadie se la va a tomar. Se quieren tomar la toma, nadie se la va a tomar. Se quieren tomar la toma, nadie se la va a tomar.
Good afternoon, good evening to everyone who's attended day one of the Afro-Latino Festival. My name is Amilcar Priestley, co-director of the festival. I want to thank everyone for coming out and for watching. I want to thank all of our participants, panelists, and speakers. And I want you guys to stay tuned for tomorrow, when we're going live and in person. I hope everyone will join us at Restoration Plaza in Brooklyn. For those who are here. That's 1368 Fulton Street, starting at 3 p.m. with the AfroLatinTalks. We'll be first joined by a group called Comiles Ami from San Basilio de Palenque to talk about the recent historic elections in Colombia of Francia Marquez to vice president. Next, we'll be talking with Betania Nascimento and Eduardo Brecho, who's also our host, about the legacy of Beatriz Nascimento, a revolutionary from Brazil from the 1970s to 1990s, who was instrumental in the Black movement and getting the community to where they are today. And finally, we'll be joined by our closer for the night, Roll She Fire, as well as La Gata, Reggaeton con La Gata, Catalina Eccleston, as well as Ron, Andre, and Terrence Laurel on the Global Business of Creativity panel. And that's at 5. And then we start with our concert at 6 p.m. And we hope to see everyone out, and many thanks. Un saludo afro a todos y cuídense mucho.